The research question of my pedagogical inquiry is how do frequent uses of a variety of inclusive checks for understanding increase Year 9 science students' engagement and learning of key concepts? To investigate this question, I have engaged in action research, which is a cyclical process that investigates teaching practice within the classroom. It follows the cyclical process outlined on this slide. The first stage of the action research is a reflection on class practice to identify problems and areas that need change. In my Year 9 science class, the focus group of this action research, I realised through observation that there were only a select few students that would consistently engage in questioning and class discussion. This slide shows a classroom seating map of verbal participation where the green dots represent students that are always responding, yellow dots sometimes respond, and the white dots are students that rarely or never respond. Therefore, the problem identified was traditional questioning and discussion is not engaging the majority of students in my class. The second stage of action research is collecting information and data. The identified problem is well established within the literature that students that verbally participate in whole class learning are the minority within secondary education settings. The literature has established three key reasons for low verbal engagement. Number one, teacher characteristics and learning choices. Two, peer influences or the fear of being wrong in front of your peers. And the last one is interest in course material. Additionally, as verbal participation in class has a positive impact on academic performance, this is a key area that needs to be addressed. The third stage of action research involves interpreting information and proposing changes. The intervention identified as a way to address the verbal minority phenomenon is to use frequent inclusive checks for understanding. Checks for understanding increases the academic performance of students and can be made inclusive through employing questioning strategies using signals or mini whiteboards. The fourth stage of action research is the implementation of the pedagogical change, which involved designing a data collection regarding the pedagogical strategy of inclusive checks for understanding. These included using mini whiteboards and hand signals for true, false, and multiple choice questions. The study was conducted over a 4-week unit on the immune system. In this study, there was a mix of qualitative and quantitative data collected. The first one, interviews, was the first type of data collected, and it focused on having student conferences with 3 focus students. The focus students were pre-selected to represent different learning abilities presented within the class. These conversations were recorded and transcribed after the summative assessment. These student conferences were conducted through the interpretive research paradigm. This lens focuses on social realities of students experiencing them. This was an important aspect of my research as I was interested in exploring students' perceptions of how inclusive checks for understanding promoted engagement and learning. Therefore, the student conferencing mirrored a semi-structured interview process with guiding questions that aligned with the study. This approach helped develop students' perceptions and attitudes of inclusive education through flexible conversations. The transcriptions of the students' conferencing were later used to develop a thematic analysis. The quantitative element of this research included the collection of formal, formative, and summative assessments. The formative assessments were online quizzes conducted at the ends of weeks 6, 7, and 8, whereas the summative assessment occurred at the end of week 9. The data from these assessment events will be conducted as a whole class approach and will be used as an indication of learning. This aspect of the inquiry was conducted through the post-positivist paradigm as it evaluates learning through measured factors. From this data, this will help indicate learning growth, but will also be used in an inferential analysis to determine the correlation between frequency of check for understandings and student retention of information. Also, we had observational data that was taken during the whole class of inclusive check for understanding events. To ensure consistent and measurable data, the observations used a structured template which set indicators to represent engagement and learning. They were participation, student understanding, and misconceptions. The final stage of action research cycle is reflecting on the implementation of the plan. This involves analyzing the findings from the data collected and examining the impact of the pedagogical strategies employed, in this case, the use of inclusive checks for understanding. To analyze the transcript of students' conferencing, I conducted a thematic analysis following Braun and Clark's six-step process to develop themes of students' perceptions and attitudes towards mini whiteboards and hand signal, as can be seen on the slide. During the initial coding and familiarization process, a few key themes began to emerge on students' views of the different uses of inclusive checks for understanding. These were then developed into the following themes. The first theme was immediate feedback. Overall, students valued the ability to test their understanding regularly and receive immediate feedback. Students felt that it was especially useful in remembering new vocabulary and their meanings. The second theme, hand signals, were safer than mini whiteboards. By this I mean students identified that they were more likely to participate in hand signal activities than mini whiteboards. The reason students were more willing to participate in hand signals checks for understanding was because they weren't as worried about getting the wrong answer. However, students were worried about peer judgment when it came to using mini whiteboards because of wrong answers and incorrect spelling. The third theme was copying during checks for understanding. Some students admitted to double checking their responses with other students around them before committing to answers. Often this would involve changing their answers to students they believed, changing their answers to answers of students that they believed to be smart. The focus students that represented the vocal minority even confessed that they would also give their answers to their peers during the mini whiteboard activities. These themes were supported by the observational data collected during the research period. It recorded high participation during all the true, false, and multiple choice events, which used hand signals. Whereas in the mini whiteboards, we only recorded a medium participation with a few students not engaging. Additionally, during mini whiteboard events, before the entire class would respond, numerous students wanted to check their answers were correct with the teacher. The preliminary findings of this quantitative analysis of this study have yet to demonstrate a significant correlation between the frequency of checks for understanding and the retention of key ideas. This may be a consequence of a significant variation in attendance, making the whole class analysis approach to this study quite difficult. Where to next? So the preliminary findings of this study have significant implications for future action research and pedagogical approaches. The qualitative aspects of this study found that students are significantly more likely to engage with inclusive checks for understandings rather than traditional methods of questioning, supporting what has been established throughout the literature. However, there are still some barriers to student participating, including fear of peer judgment. This was especially prevalent for the mini whiteboards. Future investigations could explore inclusive checks for understandings that provide anonymity and potentially integrate ICT. Additionally, this could also help address one of the limitations of this strategy where students copy one another's answers. Despite that, it is evident that generally students are happy to engage with and appreciate the opportunity to review their understanding. Thank you for listening.